So modernism. What is modernism, you might be asking yourself? It's a really good question, so congratulations already. Modernism is technically a rejection of everything that precedes it. In this particular case, it means that the artists of this generation look back at art history as something that was basically irrelevant to them. That whole thing that I was saying when we were discussing Impressionism following the Industrial Revolution and how everybody felt like, well, we're a new group of people because we have all this new technology. Our reality is different than the reality of our forefathers. So us being a new group of people, we need a new means of expressing ourselves. As technology continues to progress, and as we enter the 20th century, that's 1900, it really becomes a time when nobody's too terribly sure of anything other than things have to change, things have to progress, and they came to that conclusion as a group. But as what exactly that's supposed to look like is still up for debate. Henri Matisse is the perfect example of a modernist artist, and he was the inspiration for several generations of artists that followed him. Now, what makes him modernist is that he basically no longer feels that it's necessary for him to attach color and line and value and the formal elements to a figurative shape, even though that's really what he's doing here. This is still figuratively based, but a lot of his work basically just becomes simplified into the shape and the color and the line that most efficiently conveys what he feels the content of his work should be. And in this particular case, the joy of life, this is basically just an entire painting that's all about sexuality. Everything that you see here is pretty much made up of this same, it's very organic, curvilinear. It's described as being a sensuous line, but you see it in the figures, you see it in the trees, you see it in the ground. That sensuous line is reinforced by the color palette that you see here. There's a wide variety of colors, but each one of them could be defined as being warm and inviting, especially the figures themselves. So it's just basically this one message that you might as well have made a 6 foot by 8 foot painting that just had SEX written across the surface of it, because that's really what he's trying to convey here, is what does sexuality look like in terms of line and in terms of color. So this is basically what you end up with, and he's got a very broad body of work. This is fairly early in his career, and he becomes more and more divorced from representational subject matter as his career progresses. But really, I think that his most significant role is that he was really the first person to push what artists thought that modernism should be. And he's also one of the few people that Pablo Picasso had any respect for whatsoever, which actually is a pretty significant to say about anyone. Pablo Picasso's kind of a jerk. This next guy, Wassily Kandinsky. There's information written about him on Blackboard. Be sure to check that out. He had synesthesia. There's a video about that too. It's a fascinating condition that's actually a lot more common than you would expect. Looking at this particular painting, from our perspective, it's a collection of lines and shapes and colors, but Kandinsky could look at this and actually hear jazz music. From his perspective, he was composing music just as much as he was composing a piece of artwork, a painting in this particular case. But there's a pretty big barrier when you get to work like this, because we are so programmed to recognize visual subject matter determining what our relationship with these things are. And when you get to a painting like this, which is technically called formalism, you're not supposed to find anything recognizable. You're not supposed to attach anything from outside of the painting into the color and the line and the shape and the value, the rhythm, all of those visual elements. Now, I gave you the word formalism. Now here's the definition. Formalism is artwork that's intended to be appreciated specifically for its compositional elements. Specifically and only for its compositional elements, which means that you look at this painting, and if you like the color, if you like the shapes and you like the way that Kandinsky uses line, then that's fantastic. It's almost like the aesthetics movement, but to a much further degree. Kandinsky wants to remove recognizable subject matter from the image because he doesn't want you to bring in associations that you have. Like if we were to look at this, and it really is the first thing that people have the inclination to do is to oh look, it looks like a schoolhouse on a hill or something, and this looks like a whole flock of worm thing. They're like eyelashes clearly. You got a fried egg. There's a bird sleeping or something. What I'm doing right now is exactly wrong. By looking for recognizable subject matter and by finding, let's say, this schoolhouse, all of a sudden I'm going to attach baggage associated with school or schoolhouses or buildings on top of hills. I'm bringing in outside baggage into the painting, which then contaminates what the aesthetic experience of this thing is. Formalism is one of those things that comes across as being really pretentious, and it can be, but it really involves just being able to approach a piece of artwork and not want it to be anything other than just lines and colors and shapes and stuff. I'm not asking for everyone to love formalism, but I do want you to understand that it does have merit, and there are better and worse versions of it. And Kandinsky's versions of formalism, what you're looking at here, are very successfully done. Picasso, I'm not even going to start to get into, other than calling him a jerk several times. He was an absolutely game-changing artist. As much as he was a jerk, he was every bit... He deserved the ego that he gave himself, which was a monumental ego. But he reinvented himself several times throughout the course of his career. For decades and decades and decades, he was on top of the art game, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. He really was a creative genius, and as much as the fact that him being a jerk really makes me want to dislike his work as much as I dislike him, a lot of the work that he produces is very impressive. This was early on in his career. One of the earliest manifestations of Cubism that you'll see. I've never been a huge fan of this particular painting, but I will also say that I've never seen this painting in person. And for Picasso's work, it's not always true. People say, well, you have to see it in person, and sometimes they're lying to you, but Picasso's work really does have a much different personality when you see them. You actually can see the sketches that are underneath the paint, and you can see how he's gone back and corrected things and altered things, and it has a very different texture that you would expect in some circumstances. But his work is a lot more interesting in person, so just keep that in mind. There's a whole plethora of information that you're going to have to take in from Picasso because you have a quiz to take. So be sure to check that out. Be extra sure to pay attention to the part where they're discussing Guernica here. This is a very, very, probably my favorite of all of Picasso's paintings. Be sure to pay attention to that. One thing they don't really talk about so much is the influence of Georges Braque in the development of Cubism. And I'll actually explain to you what Cubism is in a minute. Georges Braque was probably Picasso's French counterpart, but he just didn't have the personality, the ego necessary to become a Pablo Picasso, but he was very, very influential in the formation of Cubism. And this is a great example of what Cubism is supposed to be. Cubism, and I've got this written out and typed, it says Cubism is conveying multiple perspectives simultaneously, which is a strange thing to say, but if you think back, remember when we were looking at that painting that Cezanne made of the apples on the still life of apples on a table, and the table's all weird because he would move he would move the easel around and paint from different perspectives, even though he was working from the same subject matter. Well, this is embracing that wholeheartedly, and it's basically the same thing. You just take whatever your subject matter is and paint it from multiple perspectives, which seems like a stupid thing to do, and for the longest time I really did think it was a stupid thing to do, until I started to actually read about what Cubism was intending to do, what was approaching, what its actual ambitions were, and that is to convey to you the reality of an object beyond what your eyes allow you to experience. It's a very profound and ambitious thing to say, but think about it this way. Let's say you're looking at a cube or a shoebox or something like that. It has 6 sides. Just because it has 6 sides doesn't mean that you can experience visually any more than 3 of them at a time, but that doesn't mean that the other 3 cease to exist. So you are only experiencing at most half of the world in front of you at any one point in time because of the way that perspective and the way that our eyeballs just limit our ability to take in visual information. So Georges Braque And Pablo Picasso, when forming Cubism, saw that there was a tremendous amount of value in being able to take an object and unfold it and show you every dimension simultaneously as a means of revealing what the limitations of our visual experience of the world actually is, and to be able to use some version of an aesthetic license, a creative license, to reassemble these objects in their multiple perspectives all at the same time. So they got more and more comfortable exercising some creativity as they went along, and you can kind of see how that progresses until you get to the point here. It's much more driven by aesthetic than it is by perspective, by context. But I will say that all of it's not gone, because if you look here, this is my favorite part of this whole thing. What you're looking at right here is a glass of water. If you were to draw a glass using linear perspective, then the ellipse that you have at the top of that glass suggests that you're actually looking down into it, because it dips down. But that's only half an ellipse, so the back edge is actually flat, which means that it should be perfectly at eye level. The bottom is also flat, so that should be at eye level. The left side is asymmetrical to the right side, and then this blue circle that you see at the bottom, well, that's actually the water in the glass. That's painted from the perspective of it as if you were standing directly above the glass looking down into it. What you're also looking at here is one of the earliest forms of artistic collage. Pablo Picasso would take wallpaper and newspapers and all sorts of things that were around him and just glue them to a canvas and use that as an added element to the work that he was doing, which is also, it seems like it's not all that profound a thing to do. I'm going to take things and glue them down, but he really was one of the first people to start doing that and considering it a form of fine art. So give him a little bit of credit there too. Umberto Boccioni and the Futurists. I love Umberto Boccioni's artwork. Be sure to read the information. Check out the video about him and the Futurists below in Blackboard. Just a very interesting guy and a very interesting movement. Just check that out. I'll save my breath. Okay. Now, when we were looking at Wassily Kandinsky's painting and I was talking about formalism and talking about how much of an obstacle it was to look at something and then not find recognizable subject matter, well, when I teach this particular painting in class, yeah, it's a huge obstacle just convincing people that this isn't the guy who ended up fooling all the critics into thinking that something that was garbage was actually really good and making millions of dollars off of it, etc., etc. Not the case. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. What you're appreciating about this again, or what you're at least supposed to be appreciating about this, is the formal elements. And in this particular case, the formal elements really are color, shape, space. That's about it. Now, this seems like it would be really easy to do because there are only a few elements left. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I know that you're not believing me as I'm saying this, but you have a little bit of faith. Whenever you've eliminated any unnecessary congestion into the work, then the elements that you do have remaining basically have to be composed perfectly, because any little bit of variation creates a distraction from the composition, and I'll give you a perfect example of how that happens. These are 8 red rectangles, and Kazimir Malevich is not trying to convince you that this is anything other than 8 red rectangles, but these are 8 perfectly sized, perfectly spaced red rectangles. You see here are oriented basically parallel to one another, except for this one longest rectangle here. Now that rectangle is slightly askew from the trajectory that all the other ones are taking, which means that you've got a little bit of conflict here, because if you can imagine these two lines playing themselves out further, eventually there's going to be a collision of those two things. That's enough to create a focal point, because there's your contrast. It's a very sensitive thing, and again, I'm not expecting you to go out and like make yourself a Kazimir Malevich 8 Red Rectangles t-shirt, or go buy a poster and put it on your wall. But just understand that what he's doing is something it's legitimate, It's also pretty difficult to do. I imagine this: if you were to take any one of these rectangles, even one of the teeny tiny ones, and remove it from the composition, like let's say this one is removed, then all of a sudden the visual linking between these elements is not quite as strong, and it seems like the elements, these rectangles, start to sort of float apart a little bit. You know, this teeny tiny one here, if that one was gone, then all of a sudden it seems really, really too heavy on this side, and you kill the sense of balance in the piece. At no point am I going to try to convince you that the fact that he painted 8 red rectangles is something that's impressive. It's all about the composition. Trust me on this one, you don't have to like it or love it, but just understand that there was something that was trying to be accomplished here, and he actually did it pretty well. Oh God. And then this. This is called Dadaism. This is actually referenced in one of the videos below, and I don't remember which one exactly it was, but they specifically described Dadaism as weaponizing nonsense, and that's exactly what this is. We're not going to talk about this one too much because we have to get to Marcel Duchamp. He was basically everything in art at one point in time. He did Cubism, he did Futurism, he did Dadaism, he did Impressionism, and I think life to him was like a series of video games, and he was just really good at it. He's one of those people that just excelled at everything, including each one of the isms. You know, each one of the art movements. He basically beat them and decided that he was going to do his own thing. Now, this particular fountain is a good example of Dadaism. It's also a really good example of what's referred to as a ready-made, which is an object that he doesn't create it. He went to the hardware store and he bought a urinal from the hardware store, got a brush and some paint, and wrote a pseudonym on the side of it, R. Mutt, and boom, there's his art piece. Now, the context that you have to see this in is, at the time, people were borderline militant about their artwork. The Cubists were convinced that there was only one way to make real artwork, and that was Cubism. And the Futurists felt like there was only one way to make real artwork, and that was Futurism. And they were writing manifestos, and the Surrealists were writing manifestos, and everybody was dead serious about what it was that they were trying to do. And I honestly admire that a lot because, well, really, who's to say? You know, you're in the middle of a pretty dramatic cultural transition, and you can have arguments about the right way to make art, because before this there were these broad sweeping movements that seemed to validate what it was that you were doing. So as the Cubists and Futurists and Surrealists were arguing about what it takes to make real art, Marcel Duchamp shows up and he's like, I brought this toilet. That's the first part, at least. The first part is he's trying to bring everybody's attention to the fact that, well, art really can be pretty much anything, even something that you don't make. This upsets a lot of people still today, the fact that he didn't make the toilet. How does he get to take credit for it as a piece of artwork? Well, he didn't make the toilet, but according to Marcel Duchamp, the act of selecting an object is a creative process. The fact that he specifically chose this object and decided to elevate it to the position of an art object means that he was actually doing something creative. What you'll see in the future, this doesn't take off right away, but give it another 50 or 60 years, and artists of that generation, when we get to the 60s and 70s, they look back at Marcel Duchamp, and this becomes the foundation for conceptual artwork. It becomes the foundation of postmodern artwork, which is basically that everybody can choose their own form of expression, which means that you don't have to be a traditional painter or sculptor or actor or dancer in order to be doing something that was legitimate and expressive. The second thing that he's doing is that by elevating this particular urinal to the status of an art object, is really forcing you to pay attention to it in a new context. And when seeing this thing in a different context, and it's not something that just is there to be urinated in, then you can appreciate it for its formal elements. You can appreciate the material, the smooth finish of it, those nice curvilinear composition, like these strange flanges that jut out from the side. The hollow volume that's created within it. The 5 interesting holes. It's an interesting shape. If you had never seen a urinal before and you didn't know what its function was, then you would be put in a position where you'd have to investigate it for all of these things that you typically overlook. There's a really good quote by a photographer named Edward Weston that truly seeing is forgetting the name of the things that one sees, which is a little bit clunky to say, but essentially what that means is that in order to really take in an object in its entirety, you really have to forget that you know what that object is, and just really, you can do this with anything, like tables and chairs and floors and homes or whatever, any object, if you really consider the design process that goes into it and all the different considerations and the materiality of it, anything can be elevated to the status of an art object because the process of selection is a creative process. Now the third thing, and this is the final one, is that he's actually calling this thing a fountain. We know it's a urinal because I've called it a urinal at least a half dozen times, but by calling this thing a fountain is bringing into question what the actual identity of this object is, and that goes back to what I was just saying about the relationship that we have with objects is really how we identify them. But by calling this thing a fountain instead of a urinal, it in essence is becoming a fountain. A urinal that no one ever urinates in, is it still a urinal? Well, it could be. But urinals aren't objects, are not art objects, but fountains can be. Check out the video about Marcel Duchamp. They'll explain who he is as a person. They'll explain the whole process of ready-mades, his association with Dadaism and Modernism and all those other things. But let's move on. Now, I don't have a material about this posted on Blackboard, but there's a very specific concept that Piet Mondrian is exploring here, and that concept is called dynamic equilibrium. And in this particular case, dynamic equilibrium means that he's establishing a sense of balance using the visual weight of color that you see here. He had a really interesting career that evolved from being a traditional landscape painter to just going through this generation after generation after generation of simplifying his subject matters to where he might have even started off at the very beginning of this creative process. He might have had something like a nature scene, and he would make a painting of a painting, and that second painting would have eliminated, let's say, 30 to 40% of that original information, and then he would do a painting of that second painting which would eliminate 30 to 40%. By the time you get, let's say 10 or 12 paintings down the line, you might end up with a composition that has been simplified to the point where it's really nothing more than just these lines and shapes and colors. So the composition itself just comes down to being able to balance the visual weight of those colors, and that's essentially what he's doing here. He was also a really interesting guy. I think I'm going to say that about pretty much everybody that we're talking about, but I'm not lying. That's the reason is that no one is quite sure what artists are supposed to be, so you've just basically opened the floodgates for every creative weirdo in the world to start doing things, and all of a sudden we're in a place where we're ready to pay attention to it. And Piet Mondrian was just another one of those really interesting weirdos. I said that at one point he moved from the Netherlands to New York, which is something that was really common. The World Wars created, well, a pretty good situation for the Americas, because everybody that was successful in Europe and was an artist that was able to leave, well, that's the first thing they did, is leave, and almost all of them just went to New York. It was a really interesting time to be in New York, because all the artists that left the world would be in the same bars and pubs, and they would live in the same apartment buildings, and they all knew each other, and they would hang out, and it was just probably a pretty I was going to use the word surreal, but in the context of this particular module, I have to be very careful about that. Piet Mondrian, they said that when he would go to a restaurant or something, he refused to be sat near a window because he didn't like looking at nature. Nature couldn't be strictly regimented and composed according to the constraints of dynamic equilibrium, and it bothered him a little bit. And I honestly believe that this might have been a manifestation of some sort of OCD, but, that's me making an assumption. So we'll skip this stuff, and I'll just know that dynamic equilibrium didn't have to relate specifically to just paintings. A lot of people believe that if you apply the concept of dynamic equilibrium to everything that we surround ourselves with, then we'll feel more balanced because everything will look more balanced. And it was a really ambitious thing, but they were hopeful at the time. The Bauhaus was essentially a school that was dedicated to that principle. and that everything that we produce should have some sort of design considerations taken, because really the things that we surround ourselves with really do change the way that we feel about using those objects, and then feel about ourselves and our lives and everything by extension. But we'll just jump ahead. Dali. Oh, there's videos about this below. I'm just going to skip it. Just know a very, very influential person. And I've talked about a lot of strange people, but I can say without question that Salvador Dali was the strangest. Now, Alexander Calder is going to become really relevant a little bit later when we talk about kinetic sculpture. He was originally trained to be an engineer, and he worked at a factory for a while and decided he didn't like that, and then became a firefighter, and then he became a record keeper at a lumberjack camp. I'm sure there's a better word for it than that, but eventually he moved to Paris, and he started making these little figurines that he would, they were like little circus performers, and he actually had this circus act that he would perform, and he didn't really do all that well as an artist to begin with, but the other artists that were doing well in Paris would go and visit Alexander Calder so they could go see him perform this little circus that he had made, using the principles of formalism that we had discussed before, and his penchant for making little figurines out of wire and sheet metal and stuff like that. He just ended up taking the two of these things and putting them together and making these sculptures that were essentially suspended, and they're weighted so delicately that they're constantly shifting, at least supposedly, so that you're seeing them from different angles, and you can incorporate a sense of movement and momentum along with all those formal considerations that are being made. What he was doing was something that really no one else was doing at the time, and it wasn't something that immediately took off, but he is a pioneer in a field of kinetic sculpture, which, give it a few decades, becomes something that's very, very fruitful. Now, some of Alexander Calder's work wasn't mobiles. He made a separate body of work that was called stables. He called them stable because that's exactly what they were. If the mobiles moved, then the stables absolutely did not. These things are made out of really heavy construction material, and they are absolutely massive. But these are his stables. In all honesty, I like the staples better, but that creates for a less smooth segue into kinetic sculpture a little bit later. Grant Wood is an enigma in the world of art history. In 1930, America was going through an artistic movement that was referred to as regionalism, and regionalism was really a response to the Great Depression. Most of America looked at New York, where the stock market was at, as being those are the people who ended up bringing about the depression that we're in. These are the people who, through their greed and contaminated influence and their academic backgrounds, have caused us to overlook what our key values are, what our core principles are. These good American, hard-working, corn-fed values are. So America really began to separate itself from everything that seemed like it was too academic or too foreign or too European, and they really began to double down on this whole Midwestern thing. I'll do another Google. Thomas Hart Benton was the most successful regionalist painter, and he did do some very interesting things. He had this style that was almost cartoonish, sort of abstracted, almost like everything in the image has been squeezed through a toothpaste tube or something. But he was extremely popular and extremely prolific, did a ton of work, but he was also extremely racist and homophobic and sexist, because that's what America was really looking for in that day, like some sort of stability, some sort of really solid version of an us and a them. But here he is. But yeah, he did a lot of radio interviews, and he was interviewed for a lot of newspapers and stuff, and he did not hesitate at all to drop some racism in the middle of an unsolicited question about something completely unrelated. But really remarkable figure. You can see this is actually one of his murals in context. So you can see how he's really emphasizing the nature of hard work. It's like the richness of Midwestern American culture. So those are general themes there. Now, how does Grant Wood fit into this, you might be asking? Well, that is a good question, because he was probably asking the same thing. Grant Wood was an artist, but he was also an extremely closeted homosexual. And most people today look at this particular painting and they see Grant Wood satirizing what it was that the regional artists were celebrating. The clothing that you see here is clothing that would have been more popular in the 1880s and 1890s than it would have been in 1930. The figures that you see here this is supposed to be a father and a daughter, and the father is theoretically threatening us because we are a male suitor who is going to pick up his daughter, and Grant Wood is essentially saying that she's too old to be sought after, and he's too old to do anything about it. Like the clothing that they're wearing is antiquated, and everything about this image is supposedly irrelevant. He submitted this to an art show in Chicago in 1930 or 1931, and it was declared the greatest painting in America because the people who juried the show apparently didn't catch the satire. They just saw like really solid American message and good technical skill and craftsmanship. Today, most people believe that Grant Wood was kind of underhandedly jabbing at what it was that Americans thought was in their best interest at the time. Oh dear. Now, Diego Rivera is the opposite of that. Diego Rivera was a devout socialist, and he did not hide that from anybody. In fact, this is the second version of this particular mural. The first one was painted in the lobby of Rockefeller Center in New York. He was commissioned by the Rockefeller family, who were at the time probably the most successful capitalists in the world, and he was hired to paint a mural in their lobby, and he starts to unveil this design, and they're like, hey, maybe something that's a little bit less socialist propaganda. And he's like, not so much. So he ended up finishing the mural. They painted over it, and he ended up reproducing this exact same mural in Mexico City. Now, Man, the Controller of the Universe is a very interesting piece. I guess everything is interesting to me, this presentation. But there are a lot of elements that are being combined here, and these elements really center around man, like legitimate, like the title says everything. It's like we are all of a sudden the holders of all sorts of technology, all sorts of power. We have control over these lenses which allow us to see into the cosmos and understand these massive celestial bodies, but these same lenses also allow us to create microscopes which allow us to see things as tiny as the cellular bodies. And then this little thing here, this hand holding the orb, is supposed to represent our control of the Earth in its entirety. But when you start to expand outward from that, you see where there's a lot of mixed messages coming across. Well, we do have control over agriculture, which is good. But, we also have the tendency to create war with a lot of people. And, we have references to the Red Army. You've got Zeus here, but Zeus is actually wearing a crucifix around his neck, so it's just a veil, not even veiled. It's a reference to religion in its entirety, and the fact that these religious presences are up here in the midst of these, militant bodies is not a coincidence. You have police beating people down here. You have Charles Darwin and an X-ray, and then these transistors, and then down here is this strange, pink monkey person. And over here, you've got Vladimir Lenin, and he's the hero of the people because it looks like he's handing out food or something. And then over here, you've got appears to be Karl Marx and Leon Trotsky. But there's a lot of different things, a lot of very broad social references that are being made, and essentially saying that we have control over the entire world around us, and we're doing a lot of damage to the world in response to that. But Diego Rivera, very, very influential artist. Well, he was the biggest artist in Mexico by far for several decades. I don't know that during his lifetime his reputation as Mexico's greatest artist was surpassed, but I do feel like by today's standards, Frida Kahlo, just in terms of reputation, has surpassed Diego Rivera. But it's also because she's she's another really interesting person. She's considered a surrealist painter. Frida Kahlo was actually Diego Rivera's wife. She was much younger, I think 15 years younger than him. She wasn't brought up to be an artist. She was in a horrible trolley car accident, and she was actually impaled by an axle. It ended up shattering her pelvis and breaking her femur. She spent years and years in and out of surgeries and being just generally bedridden. And it was during these times where she was bedridden that she picked up a paper and pencil and started drawing, and then really took to the idea, the general concept of surrealism, and she became fascinated by the work of this well-established Mexican artist named Diego Rivera. And then she went to art school, and he visited the art school, and she made a point to talk to him. Eventually they started a relationship, and it just goes on and on. That relationship ended up being terribly toxic to the both of them. But they were, the Mexican cultural power couple of their generation. Googling Frida Kahlo's paintings it's an interesting experience. It's definitely worth a Google. But there's a lot of things I wish we had more time to talk about, and both Frank Lloyd Wright and Frida Kahlo are two of those things. But Frank Lloyd Wright defines modern architecture. The technology that we use today, the fact that we focus on the buildings as a structure that contains an open volume that's intended to be used and not just decorated. That's something that Frank Lloyd Wright introduced. He was a huge advocate of using reinforced concrete and cantilevering. There are a lot of concepts that Frank Lloyd Wright introduced, including making structures that didn't completely ruin the environment. He was a huge advocate for horizontal, sort of low-slung buildings that sort of seem to reflect the environment and all the stacked rocks that you see here. Clearly this isn't something that is a naturally occurring element, but you can see how a lot of the design takes into consideration the things that are happening around that particular structure already. He did absolutely revolutionize architecture, and again, I wish we had more time to discuss him, but what you need to know about him is that he defines what modern architecture is. I can't overstate how revolutionary that was. He was designing homes like this, not this particular one, but there were say a half dozen homes before this one that followed this similar sort of design. There's one called the Roby House in Chicago that looks somewhat similar to this, but to the side of it was a stable. Because in the year that this house was being built, which is like maybe the 19-teens, people were still arriving to a house like this in a horse and a buggy. So just keep that in perspective. I'll just put a pin in it there, and we'll stop.